Hi everyone, Gene here. Welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, where every single week we answer the most common and uncommon questions about tapping and EFT, so you can get the most out of your tapping practice, eliminate self-sabotage, and take the action that you want. Just a quick heads up before we jump into today's show. I have started becoming more and more active on Instagram for Tapping Q&A. So if you go to instagram.com/tapping Q&A or just search Tapping Q&A, in addition to finding some inspirational quotes, what I have started posting is some tapping algorithms for different issues. And basically what a tapping algorithm is, instead of tapping in the generic way that we tap in EFT and basic tapping where we go from point to point in the order they line up in the body, it's actually a unique tapping order and a unique tapping code for a particular issue. This comes from Thought Field Therapy, which was the predecessor to EFT. So if you're looking to try a new technique and a new way of tapping, just go to Instagram, instagram.com/tapping Q&A. This is Gene Montrestelli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast, recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 394, originally aired December 9th, 2019. Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you get a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, I have something kind of fun. I'm going to share with you 12 lessons that I learned while tapping with someone who I did not know, who I met sitting on an airplane. And there's some really great stuff that we can take away from this particular experience. Before we do that, I just want to thank all of the supporters of the Tapping Q&A podcast. Because of the financial support of those people, we are in a situation that we're being able to start transcribing a whole bunch of episodes. We've even created a special website just with those transcriptions. So whenever you go and you're listening to a podcast on the website, you'll see a link above that for some of the transcripts. And we're going to keep transcribing more and more of the past episodes, so everybody has multiple ways of accessing it. And for our supporters, make sure you check out the special supporters podcast feed, or check your inbox this week, because my sister was in town. And as you know, oftentimes we do question and answer. And so we actually did a live question and answer sitting around my kitchen table. And there's some really great information that will help you to get more out of your tapping practice. If you'd like to have access to all of these free, amazing bonus audios, all you need to do is go to tappingqa.com/support. That's tappingqa.com/support. So I was on a flight from Los Angeles to Chicago on my way home from the West Coast. And I had this really interesting experience. When I got onto the plane, and I boarded later because I am a big person and I have long legs and there's no reason to sit on a long flight without it. As I got back to my seat, I was on an aisle, and in the middle seat was someone I'm just going to call Rachel. And as I was getting onto the plane, Rachel didn't look up. She didn't make eye contact. Basically, for the first 3.5 hours of the flight, she slept. And when she was awake, she didn't say a word to anybody. She was just a passenger sitting next to you. And in some ways, I'm actually pretty fond of a person who sits next to me on an airplane and leaves me alone so I can do my thing and they can do their thing. So she was awake as we were getting ready to land. And as we were getting ready to land, I just tossed my notebook, which I had been writing in because I like doing things longhand when I'm working on new ideas. And I tossed my notebook into my seat as I went up to go to the bathroom. And I noticed that Rachel looked down and looked at the notebook. And the notebook that I often travel with is one of those notebooks where it's hardbound plastic that you slide a legal pad into. And it was a notebook that I had got at the National Guild of Hypnotism's annual conference. And when I dropped it, I noticed that she read the thing on that. So I go to the bathroom and I come back. And when I return, she goes, "Are you a hypnotist?" And I told her I was, and that I use hypnosis sometimes. And she asked if I could use hypnosis to stop smoking. And I said, yeah, hypnotism is a really, really powerful tool for eliminating smoking sensations. The person that I learned NLP from, made his bones for years and years doing NLP and hypnosis to eliminate smoking cessation. And then she said, well, can you help me to quit smoking with hypnotism right now? This is lesson number 1. We're going to go through 12 lessons that I learned from this interaction. The first lesson was that she was obviously very serious about quitting smoking. So much so that she was willing to ask a total stranger in a really unusual environment in order to get some help. And it might even be a little embarrassing to do something like that in public. But because she was so willing to change and she was so really ready for transformation, it was much easier for us to do work with a person like that. And that becomes important because oftentimes in our lives, we can be in a situation where we want success and we want healing for the loved ones in our life more than they want it for themselves. And the reality is, even as a practitioner, at best, we're co-creating transformation. And in reality, the client is the one that is doing the transformation. We just happen to be guiding and using our experience and our expertise to do that. And so if lasting transformation is going to happen, it is always going to be easiest with someone who is willing. The second lesson I learned, and this was kind of reinforced because I knew this before, I carry around that particular notebook, 1, because it was one that I had, and 2, I like having it because it is a great conversation starter. Because people are aware of hypnotism and they're aware of hypnosis way more than they are of tapping. And so when they see something like that, people's interest is piqued, and so they want to know more. And so by having something like that, I was creating the opportunity for a conversation because I get asked about that particular notebook all of the time. And so we can do, as people who are involved with tapping, things that will encourage conversation because people are always going to be way more receptive when we are answering questions versus shoving something down their throat and saying, hey, I have this thing I want to share with you. I'm not saying that we shouldn't also do that, but it's important for us to recognize that when it comes to sharing stuff, being in a situation where we're getting people to ask questions is way more effective than simply giving them information. The conversation continued, and I told her that, being on an airplane is not the ideal situation for hypnosis, particularly for someone who's new to hypnosis, that it can be really, really super distracting to be around other noise. That's part of the reason why when you go to see someone who's doing traditional hypnosis, that it is a quiet office, it's a comfortable chair, there might be some soft music in the background as you do some sort of induction. And so at that point, I said, well, I do know something that actually is more effective than hypnosis. I do this wacky tapping thing, and it is actually easier to do in an environment like that. And what was really interesting was she said, oh yeah, my mom does that. She tried to get me to do it in the past. And then she demonstrated tapping on some of the tapping points. So I just asked, well, do you want to give it a try? It's something you've heard of? At that point, she agreed. Now, this is lesson number 3. In the past, I would have spent a lot of time, like when I was really early on in my tapping practice, I would have spent a lot of time explaining what tapping was and how it works and trying to convince people of how great it was. And at this point, I didn't do that because I didn't have to. I had someone who was ready to try something, and I knew that her experience with trying tapping was going to be so much more powerful than any explanation I gave. And oftentimes when we give explanations about tapping, we actually talk people out of it. That I've done that before, where I've taken willing people and I've given them too much information and I've raised too many questions for them to move forward. So lesson 3 is when we have someone who is ready to try tapping, it is best for us to try tapping. And if we can, when we are teaching tapping, if we can get people to experience it first, then they're not asking, does it work? Then they're asking, how does it work? And those are really different questions, because if I present something to you that is new and different and wacky, you're like, well, is that true? But if you have an experience where, oh, this wacky thing works, then you're like, well, how does that work? And in some cases, people don't even care how it works once they get that particular experience. So now that I had her agreement that we were going to do some tapping, in my mind, I also started to take into account where we were and the level of our relationship. So if I am working with a client who I've known for a really long time and they are sitting comfortably in their home and I'm comfortably in my office and we're not distracted, there's a lot of space for us to just have really deep conversations and be really frank about the tools that we're using and the words that we're saying and the initial sensitizing events. This particular environment, that wasn't the case. We are sitting in the middle of a crowded airplane and there are lots of people around us and there is no rapport because literally Rachel and I just met each other and we're just starting to have this conversation about transformation. And so that meant that I needed to just be really careful and tread lightly as we stepped into our conversation and as we stepped into our tapping. And so that gets us to lesson number 4, which is it's really important to understand as much as we can the state that the person we are tapping with is in so that we are doing things in a safe way. And that is, one, about the work that we are doing, that we want to make sure that we are properly skilled and appropriate to work on the issue at hand. The phrase that I always use is that if I'm not qualified to work with an issue without tapping, tapping does not qualify me to work with an issue. That there are lots of issues that if they come up with my clients, I immediately ground them, bring them back into the moment and say, that's awesome. Now let's find someone who can really work with you on this because I am not skilled enough or I am not trained to work with that particular issue for you to navigate this in a safe way. The second is to also recognize where the client is coming from. That oftentimes we feel like, well, we just need to push through and get really, really deep and dig into this stuff. And it is valuable. The deeper we get into an issue, it is really, really useful. But we need to be aware of the resource state and the emotional state and the level of rapport that we have with a client. Because if we push too hard, too fast, it is possible that, one, we push them into something that isn't really safe for them, but two, we could also break rapport because we're pushing so hard, because we're going so deep. They might not have the level of trust with us to share some of those details. And so we need to be really careful. So lesson number 4 is it's really important that we understand the resource state, the emotional state, and the disposition of our clients in the moment, as well as the environment and who we are and what we're capable of to make sure that we're tapping in a way that is useful and appropriate for the setting and the moment. And kind of a takeaway from that I think is a useful thing for us to think about as we frame that is to recognize the fact that sometimes the most successful tapping sessions are not evaluated in how far we go, but are evaluated in our client's willingness to tap again. And so give yourself permission to recognize that we don't need to do it all right now because we have time and we're creating a space for the clients to keep moving forward. So now that we were in a situation that we could tap, basically what I did is I had Rachel just tune in to the sense of craving. And I had found out in our conversation that she smoked sometimes as much as every 15 minutes, and we were multiple hours into a flight. So getting her to tune into the craving was a pretty easy thing to do. And so the first thing I had her do after she tuned into the craving is I just had her thank the craving. Even though the craving wasn't good for her, it was there trying to take care of her. And I think that's always a really important thing for us to do, is to acknowledge that the parts of us that we're struggling with are motivated by trying to keep us safe and healthy, even if they're not working in a functional way. After we did a few rounds of tapping on that, I asked her how she felt about the craving, and she reported that the craving was calmer and she felt less frustrated. And so then I said, now that we have acknowledged that maybe this craving is trying to help you, ask the craving, how is it trying to be helpful? And her response was, it's kind of like comfort food. which was a really insightful thing for her to be able to, in that moment, recognize the function of that thing. And oftentimes when we take the edge off of an issue, and instead of trying to intellectually figure it out, but ask the issue itself, we're going to be able to come to insights very similar to that. I then asked her, in what way is this trying to comfort you? And she said it was there to stop the anxiety. So lesson number 5 is that sometimes the reason why an issue exists, there might be some logic behind it. In this case, smoking the cigarette numbs the anxiety. They feel better. But that becomes that outcome, or that realization is a revelation to the client. That up to this point, they're in a circumstance that this thing that they are battling is only something that they are battling. And when we are in a situation where we are able to explain the logic, and I'm going to put the word logic here in quotes, but if we can explain the logic why the issue exists and why the issue persists, it can create a softening for the client around that particular issue. Because it is no longer their system letting them down doing something that is bad. It is now their system is choosing to do something, or is craving for them to do something that isn't healthy, but is motivated by something that is good. And when we get to the place where we are no longer fighting with this part, it is so much easier for us to make the transformation. The phrase that I have always used with my clients is we are in the process of turning our issues into our allies. Because they are. They might not be good allies. They not may be functioning well, but it makes the tapping much easier when it is not a constant battle. So as we continued to work and we tuned into the sensation, I asked Rachel, where in her body does that sensation show up? Where does the craving live? And she said, here in my stomach. But what was interesting is she didn't actually point to her stomach. What she pointed to was her solar plexus. And for those of you that don't know the solar plexus is kind of where the diaphragm is. It's between the stomach and the lungs. And so what I learned from that, and this is lesson number 6, is it's really important that we understand what the client means when they're describing something. You know, in this circumstance, she used a piece of vocabulary which she thought was very descriptive, which was the stomach. And as we'll get to in a moment, we'll see that the piece of information that she gave was really, really useful. But it was only useful because I had an accurate piece of information where she pointed, not what she said. And so oftentimes when I'm working with clients and they describe something to me, before we start tapping on it, I'm going to repeat it back to them. I'm like, well, this is what I just heard you say, or this is what I understand, so that we can get some clarity. Because in this case, she used the word stomach and she thought she was being really descriptive, when in reality, she meant her solar plexus, and that wasn't a piece of vocabulary she had, but the added point helped me out. So it's really important that we have clarity about what our client is actually experiencing in order for us to be the most helpful. So once she let me know that it was something in the solar plexus, my experience kicked in. Oftentimes, and this isn't every time, and this isn't in all occasions, but oftentimes when something is showing up in the solar plexus, it has to do with self-esteem. It has to do with how we see ourselves in the world. And so what I did was I just had her start tuning into that particular space, and I had her just start sending love and acceptance to that space. And in doing so, we were able to start clearing stuff without having to go into a great deal of information where I'm like, hey, did you know the solar plexus has to do with self-esteem? And I bet you have self-esteem issues. In that particular setting, it wouldn't have been very helpful, and it might have actually broken rapport, because it would have been me peering into her soul in a way that she might not have been comfortable to admit. Because remember, we're not tapping on self-esteem here. We're tapping on her cravings for cigarettes. And so I was able to, and this is lesson number 7, I was able to use my experience and my expertise to be useful in the moment. And this is one of the reasons why we don't always tap on our own. one of the reasons I go to a practitioner, and I'm good at this stuff, is because one, I'm too close to what is going on in my own experience, but two, the people we work with have experience and expertise which allow them to cut to the chase much faster. I have worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people just in the last couple of months. And so more than likely, if you are not a practitioner, I've done way more tapping in the last few months than you have done in your entire lifetime. And with that just comes experience and expertise, not because I'm anything special, but just lots of reps give us that stuff. And so it's important for us to lean on our experience and our expertise as a way of stepping into this. And then lesson number 8 is you'll notice, like I just said, I didn't bring up what I thought was going on because I didn't want to introduce these ideas and break rapport. And so it is important, lesson 7, that we bring our expertise, and lesson 8, that we're really thoughtful about the conversation and phrase things in a way and talk about things in a way that is acceptable. And that doesn't mean that we soft pedal. It doesn't mean that we hold back, but the level of rapport that we have is really important. Some of my clients, because of our rapport and how long we've worked together, when something comes up, I can say, hey, let's think about this here, and challenge them really directly. And maybe challenge isn't the right word, but have them focus really directly on something that might be personal, and knowing that we can do that. And the client I was working with last night, we had conversations exactly like that because it's someone I've worked with for years on and off. And so I can speak directly, and they know that I'm doing that from a place of wanting what's best for them. In this particular setting, that might have been accusatory. So for the next 20 minutes, basically, we just kept tapping and tuning in and tapping and tuning in and tapping and tuning in, and just the way that we recursively do that sort of tapping. And as we did it, I didn't just have her imagine the craving. As we made more and more progress, I got more and more in detail. I had her imagine taking a cigarette out. I imagined the smell of the cigarette, the action of lighting, that first drag, that first inhale, just trying to get her more and more in tuned. Even to, I wanted her to imagine getting off of the plane and finding the smoking lounge in the airport so that she could smoke as quickly as possible. Again, this is someone who smoked as much as once every 15 minutes, and we were now multiple hours into the flight, but we just kept recursively going deeper and deeper to get more and more in tune. So this gets us to lesson number 9, and most tappers know this, is that we need to recursively keep going back again and again and getting in more detail. So just because the SUDS level has gone down does not mean that we are done, because oftentimes the initial visioning of the problem is not very deep because it creates an emotional charge. You know, if I have conflict with someone, I could think of them and I get an emotional charge, and we do some tapping on it. And so when I think of them, the charge goes down, but then I think I have to sit with them at a meeting and the charge goes back up. And I tap on the charge of sitting with them and the meeting goes down. And then I imagine them challenging me or asking me a question, and then charge goes back up. And so what we want to do is we want to keep doing it recursively, but getting in more and more detail to see if we can keep spiking the SUDS level so it's possible for us to keep moving forward. So this goes on, and at a certain point, I could tell that she was starting to get a little bored with the process. And part of this was because I was using really general phrases. And in most cases, I was just having her move from tapping point to tapping point without repeating stuff out loud because I wanted her to feel safe and comfortable. So there's only so much time that you can say, I want you to imagine tapping on a cigarette. I want you to imagine the sensation tap here, here, and here. And so as she was getting bored with the process, I said, how do you feel? I want you to tune in. She's like, I feel great. I'm like, awesome. So one more time, tune into smoking the cigarette. How do you feel? And she's like, I feel great. But what I noticed when she did that was she licked her lips, kind of like tasty. But she reported that she wasn't feeling anything. And I said, I don't believe you. I just saw you lick your lips. I think the craving is still there. And she chuckled and she said, yes, you're right. And so lesson number 10 is in a loving, caring way, it is okay to challenge the statements that the people we are tapping with are making. And again, we're not calling them liars, but at a certain point, doing this work isn't fun. Having to keep looking at this thing I am struggling with over and over again isn't a lot of fun. And so she was getting to the point where she was tired of the process, even though there was still work to be done. And by gently ribbing her, saying, I don't believe you, gave her the opportunity to go, okay, yeah, you're right. Now, I don't do this all of the time, but know that when we're working with someone, it is okay for us to hold space for them for transformation. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes holding that space is challenging them and asking them questions to have them really reflect on what is going on. After doing this, again, we tapped and we tapped and we tapped for close to 45 minutes. We hadn't finished, but considering how far we had gone in that short amount of time and the fact that the plane was about to land, that was about all that we could do. The flight lands, we're getting up, we're walking off, and I'm just asking her how she's doing. And she said, I feel great. Normally after a long flight like this, I would have been in a cold sweat. And then she paused and she said, but I have a question for you. If I smoke a cigarette later today, does that mean I've failed? And that's a really interesting question, because what that question speaks to is the all or nothing prospect of transformation. So we were in a situation where we had just gotten off of a plane. She hadn't smoked in hours. And as we walked along, we walked past the smoking lounge and she walked right back in and she didn't want to smoke a cigarette. And so it's important to recognize that that was a success. Is it the same success as never smoking a cigarette ever again? No, it's not. But it's important that we're framing for our clients what the journey of success looks like. Because if I am doing something multiple times a day and now I'm only doing it twice a day, am I still doing the thing? Yes. But if I've gone from a pack of cigarettes to 2 cigarettes a day, that is a major victory. And so success is not an all or nothing proposition. And so lesson number 11 is it's really important for us to honor the success that people are and we ourselves are having when we are tapping. And at the exact same time, we also need to be setting really clear expectations about what success looks like. Because as we move forward, there are lots of things where we're not going to have total success with something, but our life is better because it is reduced. If the goal is to quit smoking forever, then yeah, the tapping session was unsuccessful. If we're in a circumstance where she is smoking significantly less, and she now recognizes that there's a tool out there for her to make more progress and move forward in a successful way, then we've had an amazing amount of success. So it's important that we frame for ourselves and we frame for the people we are tapping with what success looks like and why that is successful. So as we were moving along, as we were heading towards the exit, going to security, and I was going to get my bags and she was going to get our ride, one of the last things I did is I just offered her my contact information, letting her know I have all these amazing resources on my website. And if there was anything I could ever do for her, that was really, really important. And so letting her know that made her feel really supported. Like you could just see her smile knowing that this wasn't this one-off thing and that she could reach out to me personally or she could find my website. And lesson number 12 is it's really important to recognize that it's good for us to share stuff in a way where we are simply sharing it. And what was more important in sharing it wasn't about sharing how EFT works and what's the best way to tap, because I would be willing to bet that all of you who are listening to this right now know way more about tapping than she did in that particular moment. But what was really useful for her was not how much that she knew, but the fact that there was someone who cared for her and she now had access to a tool that she could use again and again. And so in some cases, the transformation is way more important than the information. because the transformation gives real world proof that this is something that works. And I think we as practitioners have a tendency to lead way too much with the nuts and bolts of the modality of tapping. And people do not care how to do something until they know it works and they have proof that it works and they're able to engage with it in a powerful way. Because like I said earlier, if they have an experience with it, they're asking, how does it work? If we're giving them a bunch of information about it, they ask the question, does it work? And if they have some hesitancy, it is going to be harder for us to share something that is useful with them because that is the case. And so it's always super important to start with where they are, what their experience is, give them something that is useful. Then once they see that arc of transformation, then they're going to want to know how, then they're going to want to know details, then they're going to want to know resources, then they're going to want to work with you again. And so those are the 12 lessons that I learned from tapping with a stranger on an airplane. It's pretty straightforward, and it was just a single experience. And in a lot of ways, it was a culmination of lessons that I've learned other places, but I hope that was useful and I hope that was instructive. If you know someone in your life who could find that instruction useful as well, please feel free to pass it along. The easiest way for people to find new audio resources is from a recommendation from a friend. That there are very few people who are going to be going and searching on Google, what are lessons people learned from tapping with a stranger on a plane? But if you share with them information like this, they're going to be much more open to it because it's coming from a recommendation of someone they love. So please be our ambassador. Don't spam your inbox. Don't send it to everybody in the world. But if you know someone in your life who could use this information, please pass it along. If you have questions about this or anything else that we do on the website in the podcast, please drop me a note, Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com. I love hearing from you. I read all of the messages, and many of the questions that I get have led to some of my favorite podcasts and some of the best things that we've ever done on the website, because we're hearing real world questions that makes it easier to create resources for people exactly where they are. You can subscribe to the podcast in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pandora, Deezer, iHeartRadio, Radio.com, Radio Public. Anywhere that you get audio, you can find the podcast absolutely free. I do know that there are now some podcasting platforms which charge for stuff. The Tapping Q&A podcast is always free. So if you're ever hitting subscribe or follow wherever you're getting the audio, it is free. Do that so you do not miss an episode. Right now, we're actually turning out 2 a week as we're cleaning up some past episodes and making them better from the archive. Those show up on Monday. New episodes show up on Wednesday. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Montrestelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyrighted Gene Montrestelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Montrestelli or Tapping Q&A.